I think a lot of people don't realize, Jeffrey Sachs, that this has been a long time coming, not just in terms of, beginning in 2004 with the greatest expansion of NATO, but also in 2020, we had NATO recognize Ukraine as what I call a de facto member with this interoperability agreement saying, we're going to integrate our armed forces. Now, what's the difference between being a de facto member of NATO and an official member of NATO? Well, it could be what you're talking about, bases. It could be nuclear weapons. People say, well, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. First of all, they should all give them up, right? We should be pushing for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which NATO emphatically opposes. So NATO,
and by the way, if I may just say that under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which we are a major signatory, we are bound to nuclear disarmament, but we're not even trying right now. So we're not even honoring the treaties that we're in, much less joining the treaties that we ought to be joining. So this is a terrible thing. And by the way, that's a huge budget cost. That is hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending on, quote, modernizing the nuclear weapons rather than negotiating nuclear disarmament. So that's another part to come back to the budget story of the past. Mm-hmm. But this story of NATO goes back actually to the early 1990s. I spoke with a wonderful historian recently who told me that in documents that he is reviewing, he hasn't published yet, Ukraine was already on a list for NATO enlargement in 1992. Now, that's, years before Putin's anywhere around on this. This is a plan that goes back to the neocons with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld in the Bush administration. So this goes back a lot. And now, interestingly, if you look up, it's a fascinating article. Zbig Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Mind you, this is before Putin's president by years. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski spells out the timeline for expanding NATO to Ukraine. And he says almost exactly the sequence as it actually happened, because what he was writing in 1997 was not just his ideas, he was writing what was already in the works inside the government. So this is a story that goes back 25 years at least, and it's been hidden from the American people. And they thought they'd get it on a bluff. The real idea of the United States was, what's Putin going to do? We're going to expand NATO, and what's he going to do? And he's going to complain, and we're going to say it's none of your business, and we're going to expand. And that was really their idea. Then Yanukovych got in the way. Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, who said, no, I don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. That's very dangerous. We'll be neutral. Well, the U.S. helped get rid of him. So this is a long, long story. None of it told honestly to the American people. And then if you say it now that this had something to do with the war, try to get it published in the New York Times. You can't.
Jeffrey, people say, I've heard this over and over again, and they quote different people, unnamed people, I won't give them the credit here. They say, look, the reason why Putin has not invaded Poland, let's say, is because Poland is a member of NATO. So Ukraine needs this protection. If Ukraine were a member, an official, not just a de facto or interoperability member of NATO, then Putin never would have invaded.
That's possible. But you know what? The way we did it, we virtually guaranteed a war. Period. In other words, to say, okay, Ukraine, you're going to join NATO, and the Russians are saying against our border, no. And then letting, as this occurred, they said, you keep pushing this, we're going to have war. And the war started in 2014 because the safety for Ukraine was when Ukraine was saying, we don't even want it. Stop. Don't get us into the middle of this war between the two of you. So the fact of the matter is this: NATO enlargement was completely unnecessary and provocative all the way back to the 1990s.
And then we saw in
But-
2019,
but just to
Ukraine
say-
embedded in its constitution this vow to join NATO.
Just to say, even the first round, which was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Russians hated it, but it didn't cause a war. That's far from their borders. Then the next round came, and the Russians were really, really annoyed because that one was on their border with the Baltics. So it was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then they said, oh, come on, would you stop? Then in 2007, Putin said, okay, you've done it. You keep expanding NATO. You promised you wouldn't, but you keep doing it. Stop. Do not come up to our border with Ukraine and Georgia. And by the way, people should take a map out and understand a little bit about this. The real goal of these neocons, the Nuland neocons, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. This is why, where does Georgia come in here? I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, Georgia's the country in the Caucasus. Where does that come from? If you look at a map, the idea of these neocons is that you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And Putin saying, don't do this, stop. And he says this in 2007. Then in 2008, Bush pushes this, and Nuland is key member of the administration then. And they push this over the opposition of the Europeans and get the Bucharest NATO declaration to declare that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, will. And by the way, Biden has been part of this all along. And the military industrial complex has pushed this. The literal lobbies for NATO enlargement have been Raytheon people. I mean, you can't make this up. This is how the U.S. government works.
Lastly,
Raytheon-
Jeffrey Sachs,
Yes.
I want to ask you about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. Should we continue on this calamitous path of endless war, propping up the Ukrainian government to the tune of $6 billion a month, spending over $115 billion to continue the war, half of that going to military contractors for weapons and military training. Meanwhile, what's going to happen to the Ukrainian economy? Because we've already read about Zelensky privatizing a lot of these industries that were nationalized under the Soviet Union. And we know that representatives of BlackRock have been over in Ukraine. And we know that Zelensky has a website. And on the website, there's a menu for privatizing Ukraine and inviting investors to, yes, invest in the military in Ukraine. Where do you see this going? Should we continue on this course?
Look, Ukraine is being destroyed. The first tragedy is for Ukraine itself. Being a place where the U.S. wages a proxy war is the worst place you can be.
I do want to push back a little bit on, I do believe that NATO, I don't think that NATO nor the West has any designs on invading Russia. I can understand why they're threatened, but I do believe that, let's talk about here we are. Here we are in a land war, and let's be honest, with NATO in Ukraine. And my sense is the best way to end this war, quite frankly, is to win it. And that if Russia wants to leave, it's over. And that if they don't leave, or that we come to some sort of accommodation where they get land for invading and killing as many people, obviously a lot of their own people have perished, doesn't that send a green light to autocrats all over the world that they have a strategic advantage, or that it's in their best interest to invade their neighbors? I mean, distinct of how we got here, isn't really the only viable way out, or the best way out for Western interests and democracies all over the world, is to convince the Russians to leave?
Well, they're not going to leave because or let me put it this way. The answer is yes to your question. If we said, if you leave, we don't come in. That's the magic word. If we said, you leave and NATO doesn't enlarge, we have a real chance. That was what was on offer in December 2021. But we said, you leave and we'll do what we want. And that's just not going to happen. That's the problem. So if we said, you leave and we won't enter the gap, I think that is absolutely a viable basis for negotiations. So my point is, in December 2021, Putin was not looking to annex these 4 regions that are now annexed, which made everything much more complicated. Now, mind you, there's also a real complication, and maybe if we have another few hours, we can talk about Crimea, because that actually is a quite complicated subject. But just to say, your basic approach is the one I take, but I add an important footnote, which is, yeah, Russia should go home, but we agree that NATO won't go in. That line I've been urging for years. The White House explicitly won't say it for a real reason, which is that Victoria Nuland has been on this jag for almost 30 years, probably. And certainly we know from the late 1990s, they want NATO to expand. And here's the point. Obama knew in 2014, he actually gave an interview for which he was heavily criticized. He gave an interview that said, I don't want to get into this more because Russia has escalatory dominance. And what he meant by that is whatever we do, they can take it up a notch, up to nuclear war. And they care about this a hell of a lot more than we do. So I don't want to take the first step and then have my have the pot raised by the Russians, and then we match or raise and go on, because they can keep doing this. They will not allow NATO to expand to Ukraine. To my mind, that's been the story all along.
So, Jeff, you've been generous with your time. I just have one last question. We've kind of done a whirlwind tour geopolitically. I know you speak to a lot of people at the highest levels. So let's do the magic wand question. The president or the White House or Congress only has the bandwidth or the ability to get 2 or 3 things done. What do you think are the most important initiatives that we can take here in the U.S. to ensure not only continued prosperity, but progress?
You know, the key to prosperity is investment. We don't invest enough in this country. Our domestic investment rate, it's not properly measured, but even if you add in the R&D, you add in the fixed investment, and you add in the education spending, it's a shadow of what it should be, because we've got between 1/3 and 1/2 of this country basically outside of the education and even the physical infrastructure increasingly for a prosperous life. And that's where our real issues are. It's a great country. We should invest in it. And that's where we should be putting our public finances. That's where we should be putting our efforts. That's where companies should be devoting their time, not fighting over Ukraine, not having a world war threat over Taiwan, not having 800 military bases around the world, all huge anachronisms. The impressive thing about the United States in the last 30 years, the most positive economic point, and it's a surprise for me if I think back 30 years, we really sustained the technology investments. In fact, not just sustained them, we increased them. And the payoffs have been huge. Our R&D spending is big and wonderful, and it's actually generating huge amounts of new technology. But then we don't invest in the people. We don't invest in basic health care. We don't invest in poor people and poor communities. We don't even have a concept of social housing. I've been spending a lot of time in Vienna this year, which is magnificent and has, 100 years of tradition of social housing. We don't even have the concept right now in this country. And this war stuff is a complete drain. So what I said to the administration at the beginning, though they could care less what I said, but I said, don't do foreign theatrics. Don't get entangled even more. Build this country peacefully. And there's enough for the whole world to have a mutual benefit. Don't break trade. Don't break agreements. Don't contain China. What a waste of time for us. Let's invest in the United States. So that would be my answer. I've seen so much now of the U.S. destabilization of other countries. It's disgusting, and it's just not covered. And by the way, just to give you another journalistic, weirdness, I was friendly with Aristide in Haiti. I liked him. I wanted to help him. He said to me, Jeff, they're going to get me. And I thought, oh, come on. No, they're not going to get you. I'm going to help you. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. It's going to be fine. No, they're going to get me. And okay, I didn't get it. Then, of course, Bush stopped all World Bank loans, IMF loans, Inter-American Development Bank loans. They used the usual financial squeeze to break him, but he remained there and he remained popular. So they eventually threw him out in a coup, and they landed a plane with an unmarked tail, and they stuck him in the plane and they flew him to Central Africa. Okay, I knew a bit about what was going on, and I called the New York Times reporter. I said, there's a coup in broad daylight. Would you cover this? And you know what I was told? The editor's not interested in that. A coup in broad daylight, and the editor's not interested in covering that. That's actually how it went down. And then I testified in Congress a few days later to a committee where everyone swore how much they loved Haiti. And boy, it was so good that Aristide was taken out of harm's way that the United States saved him by flying him out. You can say anything in this country right now. I mean, our government can say anything in this country, that 6 people in a yacht or a rowboat blew up Nord Stream. You say anything, and the New York Times sucks its thumb and says, yeah, that's what an unofficial senior official said, unnamed senior official in the United States government said, and that seems right. And that's how we are right now. No one's talking, no one's thinking.
So I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you about that specific media part. Before I do, let me just, on the substance of Ukraine, a lot of times people say, I don't understand. What they're really trying to do is make some rhetorical point about something not making sense. That's not the way in which I mean this. I genuinely don't understand the following. Neocons obviously were kind of catapulted into a position of power in Washington after 9/11. All their dreams, invading Iraq and having regime change plans for the broader Middle East, were all being empowered. And with the disaster that they ushered in, that everybody recognized, the foreign policy community kind of said, all right, we're done with these crazy people for a while. The second term of the Bush administration kind of reined them in. Obviously, Obama was elected on a promise to reject neoconservatism. And for a long time in Washington, it wasn't just people, like you or like Noam Chomsky, but I mean like very sort of middle of the road, centrist, mainstream people like Bill Burns, like President Obama, like Donald Trump, whose view was Ukraine is not a vital interest to the United States, that vital interest doctrine always being central to how we formulated our foreign policy, what we were not willing to go to war for, that it's always going to be a vital interest to Russia, but not to Ukraine. That was what Obama eloquently argued. That was what Trump also argued in his own kind of Trumpian way. Biden was part of that Obama administration. That was clearly the position of the Biden administration, of the Obama administration. Now here we are, to the extent that I could discern any interest that we might have had in provoking the Russians into that war, it was accomplished in the first week or two when we got the Europeans to disassociate themselves from Nord Stream and start buying our own natural gas. That was mission accomplished. And yet here we are a year and 2 months later, a year and 3 months later, there's clearly no attempt, none, on the part of the U.S. government to try and negotiate a peace deal. In fact, they blocked them when they emerged. And we seem to be getting deeper and deeper and deeper involved into this war, which at the end of the day is about nothing more than who will rule certain provinces in eastern Ukraine or what will be their status. What changed in Washington that has made bipartisan Washington, not just neocons, but the vast majority of the establishment wings in both party and the Biden administration, so committed to this war, with seemingly with no end in sight?
Yeah, Glenn, I think the part that can help on this is that the neocon part never went away, and it was core to the Obama administration. It wasn't foreign to the Obama administration. And let me just illustrate, nothing was really reined in. Remember, 2008, the last year of Bush Jr., was when the commitment of NATO made at the Bucharest NATO summit that NATO would enlarge to Ukraine and Georgia, by the way, was made. So nothing was reined in at the end of the Bush administration. People should look on a map, by the way, Georgia, and not Atlanta, Georgia, Georgia in the Caucasus. What's Georgia doing there, for heaven's sake? Well, if you look at the map, the plan is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounds Russia in the Black Sea. That's the idea. So that was there consistently from the early 1990s. Brzezinski explained it in 1997. It continued to be U.S. policy in 2008. Then comes the Obama administration, but Obama supports lots of war, and this is not well understood. But it's not well understood. You had Hillary, of course, who I don't know if she ever saw a conflict she didn't want to get more deeply into. But for example, Syria. It's never been explained to the American people. Syria was not a civil war. Syria was a U.S. CIA-led regime change operation that went terribly wrong. And we actually, in our mainstream press, say, Russia came into Syria. How dare they do that? We were in Syria in 2011 with CIA to overthrow Assad. I happen to know, again, because of my role in diplomatic circles, that in 2012, there was an agreement to end the fighting in Syria, but it was blocked by one party. You know who that was? That was the United States.
I was going to guess.
Everyone else agreed to a framework that was being put together by the highest diplomacy. The U.S. blocked it. The mediator talked to me at one point. Jeff, you cannot believe it. It's one government. It's the U.S. which insists Assad must go the first day. Everyone else wanted to do something pragmatic to stop the fighting. The fighting ended up going on many years. At the end of that year in 2011, there's NATO bombing and ending up, driving to his death and creating another decade of real civil war and outside war. Libya, killing Muammar Gaddafi. It was the Obama administration, Victoria Nuland as Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in February 2014 that participates in the violent overthrow of Yanukovych. So Obama, he had some important good sense in 2014, said, I don't want to get more deeply into it, but it was his administration. First of all, of course, Europe could have stopped this, but it would have taken, at a minimum, it would have taken France, Germany, and Italy, the leaders, all of whom, by the way, early this year were on the same track that there was a way to either prevent the war or stop the war, but acting together, which they did not do. And they were unwilling to stand up to the U.S. on that. But I think another interesting observation in how the U.S. kind of batted Macron aside, Schultz aside, Draghi aside in the first months of this year is an observation that I heard from another European leader, which I think is pretty astute, which is that, look, the U.S. has moved on. The real front line of U.S. foreign policy is not Western Europe. The real front line really is the Baltic states, is Poland, is Ukraine. They rather like that fact. That is the more eastern countries. Now they're really something. They're big in the U.S. Imperial view, and somehow this is even more disheartening to Western Europe. But the fact of the matter is, I actually have no doubt in my mind, having been around for 40 years with these processes, that if the European leaders had said clearly, privately, publicly, any which way to Biden, no, this is not right, and we don't want this war, and we've got to do this a different way, and you've got to sit down with Putin because that's what this is really about, and he's laid out a basis for sitting down, it would have happened. Because the U.S. could not resist that, actually. So who bluffed whom, or who said wait, or who said don't worry, hard to know. But the Europeans lost the chance, and Brussels, of course, is useless in this. That's part of the problem. Brussels has been useless and completely on side. And your country, Alexander, is just so excited to be fighting the Second Crimean War. They can't even contain themselves. Palmerston didn't get his way in 1856, so we're going to get our way in 2022. It's almost a joy for them. Terrible to say.
Sadly, very true. Do you have time for one more question from me?
Of course.
So it's about the fact that to my mind, all the Brzezinski plans, all these grand chess games, which ignore the people, because if you treat countries as pieces on a chessboard or squares on a chessboard, you're already going, I think, seriously wrong. But it's so 20th century. It's so part of the world in a way that existed in the first half of the 20th century. It didn't end well, by the way. There is now another world beyond Europe. We have, you were in Bali, you saw all of these other countries now asserting themselves. We're fighting, it also seems to me, we not only created a disaster, it's a disaster fighting battles left over from 170 years ago, which have lost their meaning now, or at least that's so it seems to me.
Hey, Jeffrey, are you familiar with the structural financial crisis theory developed by the Russian economist Mikhail Kazin in the last 20 years? He predicted the globalist world split into currency zones or blocks.
I'm not familiar with the theory, I apologize, but I would say the following about blocks and currency zones. First, we shouldn't want them. So again, I don't tend to believe in deterministic outcomes. I believe that we have choices, though we often make very bad ones. Second, specifically on currency blocks, it's a pretty interesting point and very relevant for us. The U.S. At the beginning of the war said that cutting Russia off from SWIFT was the so-called nuclear option. Aside from the horror of the use of that term in this context anyway, the fact is that it proved to be pretty non-consequential. And the reason is actually quite basic. And I said so, by the way, to the U.S. government at the time. Don't count on your sanctions having so much effect. Nothing much is going to happen. They don't work the way you think, and so forth. It was pretty obvious. But there are many ways to transact. You do not have to go through a U.S. bank, U.S. dollar, and SWIFT. Bottom line. And you can go through yuan, you can go through rupees, you can go through rubles. There are lots of ways to transact. When we teach monetary economics, as I have at Harvard and Columbia for 40 years, you say money's a veil. In other words, it's not the real economy. It facilitates the economy. And the idea that the dollar is the irreplaceable, indispensable currency, and so that's America's real hold on global power. All that the United States is doing is dramatically accelerating the end of the dollar special prerogatives and privileges, because frankly, if you're not getting along with the United States geopolitically, do not hold dollar reserves. They're going to be grabbed, whether you're Venezuela or Iran or Russia or some other country. And so there are other ways to hold reserves and to settle payments, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Danielle says, what future role do you see for the United Nations? Will it be able to be reformed to be more representative of sovereign states and people of the world and out of pocket of the United States and interest groups?
You know, I spend most of every day for the last 22 years trying to help the UN. And I have to tell you, I haven't been paid. They owe me $22 because I do it $1 a year every year. I haven't seen my dollars yet, but I am a believer in the United Nations, though it's easy to be mocked for that. I think the UN was one of the great visions by our greatest president, who really was a great man, Franklin Roosevelt. I don't think that of too many of our presidents, but he really was a great man, and he had a great vision, which was that there could be a UN. Of course, it's flawed in many ways, but it's also completely essential. If we turn away from war and peace, we really do have a climate crisis. That's another discussion that has engaged me almost all my career in life, and it's very real. And now, of course, we don't pay attention to it in the midst of all of this mess. But the point is, as hard as it is to do anything in this world today, you can't do it actually without global cooperation. And to have global cooperation, you need institutions, and you end up with a UN. So if we didn't have it, we'd invent it. Then we would find out how damn hard global cooperation is for all the obvious reasons. First of all, politicians have their power base, and if they are democracies, their electoral base at home. And so that is the starting point, which is it's not easy to get the cooperation. But also all the points we've been talking about of the kind of delusions of grandeur of the neocons and so forth impedes it as well. So my answer is it's a long talk. It would help me to explain why I've spent 22 years virtually nonstop trying to help the UN. I believe in it. I believe it's absolutely essential. Incidentally, all these, the charge that the U.S. makes about the UN, for example, can't go to the UN Security Council because of the veto. The fact of the matter is the veto has been not a bad thing, actually. If the United States had listened to many of those vetoes, it would have avoided multiple disasters. When Russia and China vetoed the Iraq War in 2003, that wasn't anti-US. That was just sanity. And if the United States had said, maybe we should reconsider, we would have saved several $1 trillion and a lot of global grief. So even whatever one thinks about the veto, it says something when major powers say, I don't agree, they should talk to each other. Of course, what's happened specifically with the Security Council is it's become no more than a theater for sound bites. They don't deliberate. They don't analyze things. They just give speeches. It's really degraded in its actual operation, because if the Security Council actually studied any of the problems it's grappling with, really looked at the evidence, honestly, brought in outside expertise, these problems are solvable. And I often think, if I might, since I work a lot with the Vatican also, they have a very good idea when they elect a new pope. As you know, they lock the cardinals in the room And I've thought that we probably could end the Ukraine war peacefully if the Security Council was put in the chambers, the door was locked, conclave, and they were told, you don't come out until the white smoke appears above the 38th floor. They could actually solve this. And of course, they don't do that. They want the sound bites for the news cycle. They're not actually talking with each other.
Well said. Two more?
Of
Two more
course.
questions? Awesome. Thank you very much. Commander Crossfire asks, does Russia's political system allow for a strong leader to follow Putin, or does it stifle strong ambition? What is the shape of the Russian deep state, and what is the future of the post-Soviet state or the neo-union?
Such easy questions. We should have stopped before. The only thing I would say, and I don't know the answers to those questions, but the only thing I would say is one of the things I've observed in advising governments in well over 100 countries over the last 40 years is how deep political cultures are. Political cultures are much deeper than economic structures or technologies and so forth. I really believe that if you look at Xi Jinping, you can see a Han Emperor there as well. And not surprisingly, because it was really in about 200 BC that China formed a centralized administrative state. It's in many ways brilliant statecraft, arguably the most successful statecraft on average over 2,000 years. And the current state, though it's a completely different political structure in the People's Republic, looks a lot like the China's centralized administrative state. I would say, I don't know if you two as real experts would agree with me, but when I look at President Putin, I see a czar because the political culture is similar. It's not surprising. This is hundreds of years. It's deep. It came for reasons, by the way. There's history to it. And I think we should understand this, by the way. This is why the finger pointing and so forth about, your regime is illegitimate, yours is this, yours is that. That's fundamentally profoundly naive and mistaken because these political cultures are quite deep. China's not going to look like the U.S. system. The U.S. system has its own roots. Part of it is a debacle, by the way. Part of it is very good, but it comes out of a cultural matrix. And so I would expect Russia in the future to look like Russia in the past in political culture. I don't bemoan that, by the way, because there are lots of ways to meet public needs and public goods. There's not just one model. And the more you live and the more you know your own society and how flawed it is, the more you look also to other countries and examples to understand maybe there's some better ways to do some of these things. And that's why I, insist on U.S.-China dialogue, why I'm hosting symposia to bring together ancient Greek and ancient Chinese knowledge and so forth. This stuff is good that we talk to each other and that we understand political culture as a real thing and not as a ranking, as is so much done, and especially as a cookie cutter, that there's one way to do this and that's how it's going to be done. That view is part of the naivete and arrogance that gets us into so many problems.
About the Ukraine war. A lot of the world is watching these events in horror. They view it as a horrible clash between Russia and the US. They don't see this, as we do in the media, as an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine. Most of the world doesn't see it the way we describe it. Most of the world is just terrified right now. And then you also said something about Nord Stream, which us as Germans is, of course, a matter to us, is a matter of special importance. and you say, I would bet, so you're not sure, but you would bet the explosion was a US action, perhaps US and Poland. And it's worth to note that you advised Solidarność, the Polish anti-communist labor union, and also the Polish government on its transition plan, and you were awarded with one of the highest honors in Poland, the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit. So you have Poland's highest government honors, and you also hold an honorary doctorate from Krakow University in Poland. So you said you bet that most likely the US blew up Nord Stream. Can you explain?
Well, I said that even before Seymour Hersh described in detail how it happened. And I think Hersh's account is right now basically unchallenged and is essentially correct in my view. We know that to blow up this pipeline required a state actor. In other words, this was a massive, massive logistical challenge. Those are big pipes. They're encased in concrete. They're 240 feet below the water surface. There are strong currents. This is a massive operation. So some government or governments did it. And then the question is, which ones? And the intelligence agencies have been quite clear, actually, that Russia did not do this. Russia did not destroy its own infrastructure. That leaves just a few possibilities. And what makes me think that the United States did it, and I would say even before Hersh's account, is simply the fact that the United States said it was going to do it. President Biden said, with Chancellor Scholz standing next to him on February 7th, 2021, excuse me, that 2022, let me make sure I get this right, that if Russia invades, that is the end of Nord Stream. And the reporter said, but Mr. President, this is infrastructure of Russia and Germany. He said, believe me, we have our ways. And as soon as the explosion happened, the former foreign minister of Poland, who's in the know, he's a very well-connected person, tweeted, "Thank you, USA." And then our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said, we view this as a tremendous opportunity to wean Europe from Russian energy dependency. Then Victoria Nuland, our Undersecretary of State, said in the US Congress, we are delighted that Nord Stream is a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. Well, you really don't get much more than this. They're delighted at an act of international terrorism. They said Nord Stream would end if Russia invaded. Seymour Hersh's account describes technically how this was accomplished. And frankly, Europe just doesn't want to look at this. It's, oh my God, it's our ally. What are we going to do? So the German government won't report to the Bundestag. The Swedes won't report to the Germans. It's an unbelievable confusion, except for the fact that if you're an American, 68 years old as I am, you've lived through lots of covert operations. This is normal for the United States. This is not exceptional. That's maybe what's hard for people in Germany or people in Sweden or people in other places to get their head around. If you're an American, well, this is what Americans do. This is what covert operations are. We've been doing this for decades. And so I think it's, someone could come along with another story, but frankly, I'd be very surprised.
Well, there is another story. There is another story, and of course that popped up a few weeks ago. But to color this, I've lived in the U.S. for 10 years, and I became a naturalized citizen in the early 2000. So I have dual citizenship and I pay dear taxes for it. So I know this. But in Germany, people have basically this idealistic view of foreign policy, and they basically don't see covert operations, and basically they follow the U.S. mainstream media view quite clearly and quite straightforwardly. And there's lots of or very little contradiction. And so we do have another explanation right now than. Shortly after Chancellor Scholz went to the US, there was a story in all of the German mainstream media that was a sailing yacht with about 5 people on it that blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. And this ran on mainstream media. What do you say to this?
It worries me that the U.S. government can't come up with a better cover story than this ridiculous one. Even the Swedish government has laughed and said this is an action by a state, not by 6 people on a boat. This is ridiculous, frankly. And it would be interesting to know what President Biden and Chancellor Scholz discussed privately when they didn't have a single aide around, didn't do a press conference, and then this story appeared the next day. Again, frankly, this is so typical, except I would say that the cover stories are getting more and more ludicrous. Nobody believes this story. It was, of course, repeated in a few mainstream places, but that's a game. That's not a real story. You know, it's important for people to understand. Let me give you another point. A top journalist of one of our top newspapers that basically pointed that the Russians did it at the beginning, said to me privately when I met him just afterwards, I said, I think the U.S. did this. He said, of course the U.S. did this. Of course the U.S. did this. Who else? I said, why doesn't your paper say so? And he said, well, the editor's not so interested in that. I said, it's really disappointing for me because a long time ago when I was young, your paper ran the Pentagon Papers about the lies in Vietnam. It ran the Watergate exposés. He said, oh, that paper is so dead and gone. We're in a game. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people don't understand it. But if you've been around U.S. foreign policy, as I have for decades, it's transparent. It's not even hard to decipher. That's why it didn't take me long to reach this conclusion. Then came Seymour Hersh with all the details because he has disgruntled people inside the intelligence community who are very unhappy about this, telling him very interesting things. They don't tell me, but they tell him. But it wasn't hard to decipher this. This is not such a complicated case.
It looks pretty clear, but if all the media go the other way, it's still difficult for ordinary people or for people who are not in the know to believe the opposite point. Although it looks quite logical if you see how countries operate. And you said, and you wrote a piece, and you wrote books on U.S. foreign policy, and you wrote a recent piece this April 13th where you said that you completely agree with Emmanuel Macron, that he spoke the truth when he said that the European Union, though an ally of the U.S., does not want to be a vassal of the U.S. And you said that is the truth. And you also speak of a strategy of U.S. dominance, which includes economic warfare and dependency of allies, so to say, in my own words, that Ambassador Robert Blackwell lined out. And Joe Biden is basically following this playbook word by word. So how is this U.S. strategy of dominance? You also, I should insert, agreed with Donald Trump when you said the U.S. should withdraw from Syria pretty soon. And as we both know, the U.S. is basically illegally occupying Syria's oil fields. So, it's a perfectly reasonable statement to make. But
what we learned from 60 years ago is unbelievably relevant and important today. And that period was the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we have ever come to nuclear annihilation, though we're heading that direction right now. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't know if everybody realizes we came within 1 or 2 seconds of nuclear war, actually, not because of what Kennedy and Khrushchev were doing, but because of what one captain on a disabled Soviet submarine decided to do when he thought he was under attack by U.S. Navy, and that was his decision to launch a nuclear-tipped torpedo, which, if it had launched under U.S. doctrine, would have led to an automatic, full-scale nuclear attack by the United States against the Soviet Union, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and China. The goal of the U.S. attack in such a circumstance was to take out 700 million people. We now know from the physics it would have ended humanity entirely, but we came that close. The order of the captain was countermanded by a senior official who happened to be on the submarine, who said, "I don't think it's a good idea. I think we should probably surface. Maybe we're not under attack." And in fact, that's what they discovered, that Kennedy and Khrushchev had actually reached an agreement for ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the thing to understand about the Cuban Missile Crisis is they compromised. They compromised. All of Kennedy's advisors, almost every single one, said, "Go to war. It's our reputation. We cannot. We can win." Whatever stupidity they said. And Kennedy intuited, this can't be right. This is too dangerous. Khrushchev felt the same way, even when he had placed the missiles in Cuba. He didn't want war. He wanted to give the U.S. a taste of its own medicine because the U.S. had put missiles in Turkey. So the two of them figured out how to compromise, that Russia or the Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba. The United States would remove the missiles from Turkey. The U.S. would pledge never again to invade Cuba. And on that basis, the two sides would disengage. One really very unpleasant part, it's a little bit carping after you've saved the world, but I'm going to carp just a little bit, was that Kennedy insisted that the U.S. side of the compromise, which was removing the missiles from Turkey, should be kept secret by Khrushchev. And one of the most amazing things in history is that Khrushchev kept that secret. He even lost his job in 1964 because he said to his colleagues, and he wrote in his memoirs, "What, should I have World War III so that I violate the agreement I made?" So he kept the agreement that he had made with Kennedy. Kennedy insisted on the secrecy for U.S. domestic political reasons. Most of Kennedy's own aides didn't realize the compromise that had ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think it's so relevant. If you don't mind, I want to take us back just a couple of years, even before that, because we're in the same situation right now. How did we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis? We got to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 because Khrushchev put in offensive nuclear weapons. But why? Because the United States had invaded Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was one of the stupidest American foreign policy moves in modern history. And Kennedy had presided over that. Now, Kennedy was just a beginning president, and the CIA, our most dangerous and failed institution in American history, in my view, had put this harebrained idea on Kennedy's plate and told him, "You have to do this, Mr. President, and it's bound to succeed." And of course, it was bound to fail. And it was a disaster that led to another disaster to another disaster. But the Cuban Missile Crisis came from a U.S. invasion of Cuba. And one of the striking things about that invasion is that when it started, Khrushchev and Kennedy had already established a secret line of communication to each other, a back channel. And Khrushchev wrote a letter to Kennedy, which is incredible to read. It says, "Mr. President, piratical elements of your government are undertaking this illegal international operation. Surely you don't know about it. You need to stop it. And Kennedy wrote what I regard as really one of the worst things he did. He wrote back a letter to Khrushchev saying, "What? Us? We have nothing to do with this. This isn't the United States." And that was, the direct lying is not good. It can get you into trouble. It can even get you into an end of the world when you're lying to a nuclear superpower. So that actually was the second big lie by an American president to a Soviet leader in a short period of time, because just before that lie and the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a debacle, was the U-2 spy plane flight over the Soviet Union, where the CIA had told President Eisenhower in his last years, don't worry, they could never hit a U-2. They could never capture it. And if they do, the pilot has a cyanide pill. They'll never be taken alive. And the plane is designed to disintegrate if it's hit, blah, blah, blah. CIA stuff, very typical. Of course, the Soviets shot down Gary Powers in the U-2 spy plane. It derailed all the diplomacy of the day. But even more striking was Eisenhower was told, okay, they couldn't have the pilot, the plane disintegrated, so Eisenhower lied. He stood up and he said, well, that is an American weather plane that went off course from Turkey. And then the Soviets produced the spy plane and produced Gary Powers alive. And so Khrushchev felt, God, these people just lie to your face baldly on matters of fundamental national security. And this is the second time that happened. So if you unwind, it's remarkable. By the way, you can unwind even further, and I think nobody does anymore, but even the Cold War itself could have been diffused in the mid-1950s. And the issue is quite relevant, actually, for Ukraine, ironically. I'm in Vienna. In 1955, Vienna became, again, the capital of an independent country, and the Soviets left voluntarily from their post-World War II occupation because Austria declared neutrality. And the Soviet Union said, okay, neutral, we go. You're not a threat to us. And what the Soviet Union was saying to the United States is, make Germany neutral. Don't remilitarize Germany. Don't make it part of your most advanced military bulwark, because they just killed 20 million of our citizens. And the United States, of course, was completely tone deaf to that. In fact, that's the whole approach of U.S. foreign policy. Don't listen to what the other side says. So George Kennan, who was our really greatest diplomat historian and author of Containment, but he meant containment in a kind of political manner, not in this highly militarized nuclear arms race matter, said in 1957, make Germany neutral, and then the Cold War ends. Then the Soviets can leave Central and Eastern Europe. Then we can have peace. And of course, no one was listening to Kennan at the time, because the U.S. always wants arms races. Okay, so all of that is the background to the 1963 speech, because Kennedy really was a man of peace who found himself at the brink of nuclear war through stumbles, mistakes on both sides. And that's the real truth of Kennedy. He really wanted peace, and yet he almost presided over the end of the world. And he was deeply shaken at the end of 1962. And Khrushchev, who was a real human being, by the way, was deeply shaken at the end of 1962. And both of them corresponded. We got to get off the brink. We have to back off. This is very dangerous. And Kennedy gave this absolutely remarkable speech on June 10, 1963, which is my favorite speech of an American president in modern history, saying we can make peace with the other side. This is the height of the Cold War. Everyone hates the Soviet Union and the United States. All the propaganda, all the anti-Soviet, anti-Russian sentiments that we have today, every day in our newspapers, was even more then. They're out to kill all of us. That was every day. And Kennedy said, no, we can make peace. They are human beings. They want peace the same way we do. They have every reason to abide by an agreement, a peace arrangement that's in their interest as it is in our interest. And then Kennedy said, and we should hail the Russian people for their great achievements in the arts, in culture, in science, in space, in valor, in bravery. Can you imagine? But of course, that's what Biden should be doing if he even gave one speech to the American people about this. Of course, who could ever expect the eloquence or the wisdom of Kennedy right now? We could never expect it. But the amazing thing about that speech, which is why I wrote a book about it 10 years ago, because I love it, the speech was so wise, so smart, so much relevant for a man who had almost stumbled to nuclear war, the absolute opposite of what he wanted. And he knew how dangerous the world is. When the speech was delivered, Khrushchev read the translation, said he called the U.S. envoy, Averell Harriman, who was in Moscow, and said, this is the finest speech by an American president since Franklin Roosevelt. I want to make peace with your president. 5 weeks later, they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It's an incredible story because I said in my op-ed, it's like a mathematician would say, a constructive proof. You don't actually just prove that peace could happen. You show it. You prove it by making it. So the speech led to a peace agreement, and it's completely relevant for what we have today. First of all, Kennedy knew both sides had led to the war. Both sides had led to the near global destruction. Both sides needed to back off. Both sides wanted peace. And this is where we are today. Exactly the same thing, except we have this drumbeat, crazy drumbeat in the media, which you two so wisely talk about every day and report on, which is insane. By the way, led by the British. I respect the British. You speak English so much better than we do. It's yours. But this Russophobia in Britain is so deep. It's about 200 years old. It's so simple-minded. I used to even read The Guardian, by the way. Now I can't even go to the website. It's unbelievable. By the way, that's how our New York Times is. It's unreadable. It's phony. It's propaganda from morning till night. It's so completely one-sided, and no one tells the history of anything. And I tried to publish that piece in the New York Times. Well, they rejected it in 10 seconds. And more than that, I tried to publish anything in the New York Times, and they said no. What they want to say is it's an unprovoked invasion, and we're facing a madman, and there's no one to talk to, and war is the only way, and NATO enlargement is the only way, and diplomacy can't work, and every lesson of history is ignored. That's where we are.